We have here, and we have the committee members. So with that, we'd like to call the meeting to order, and we'd ask the cameras leave the room. Okay, we're here today. We have two sets of panels, or two panels, one taking us for the first hour from 3:30 to 4:30, another one from 4:30 to 5:30. And with our first panel, and we're dealing with Bill C-50, we have the privilege of having with us the Canadian Arab Federation, and I will introduce you and then yield you the floor at that appropriate time. So I will start with introducing Mr. now Beaugenet. Good to have you here, and I believe you have with you Ms. Shirazi. Good to have you here, and the floor is yours. You have 7 minutes, so we'll yield you the floor now.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Mohamed Boujanan. As you said, I'm the Executive Director for the Canadian Arab Federation, and with me today our legal counselor, Amina Shirazi. So I'd like to thank you for the invitation. Briefly, just to give you a little bit of information about our organization, the Canadian Arab Federation is a national non-profit membership-based organization representing Canadian Arab descent, on public policy issues. Since its founding in 1967, CAF has sought to create non-partisan relationship with the media and government officials in order to highlight issues of importance to the Arab community, including those concerning immigration and refugees protection right. The Arab in Canada have been here for a while. I mean, the first immigrant or the first wave of Arab immigrants came here in 1818 from the Syrian and Lebanese community. But of course, we receive on a regular basis a newcomer, and according to Statistics Canada, the Arab immigrant now are one of the fastest growing immigrant population in Canada. According to Stats Canada, again, we are between 350 and half million of Arab immigrant or Canadian from Arab descent. Recently, actually, in Quebec, for example, 45% of this immigrant population increase since 2000, especially in the Montreal region. Those people, of course, comes from North Africa mainly, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. To switch to French quickly, l'arabe est aujourd'hui la deuxième langue parlée dans les écoles francophones dans la région de Montréal.
Arabic is the second most popular language that is spoken in Montreal schools. It is a language that is quickly growing in its use. And for some time now, we have been witness to a phenomenon that is the following. There's been a decline in Arab immigration. The waiting list for these communities are much longer than for other communities. And in fact, today, the Arab Muslim world is subject to a different set of rules when it comes to immigration. This can be explained by the anti-terrorist measures that have been implemented since September 11th. With all due respect to the democratic process and with respect to the invitation that we've received, we are not here to validate today's exercise. We believe that the component that deals with immigration in Bill C-50 has to be debated thoroughly. In fact, it should be split in two. We believe that today's proposed changes are considerable and significant changes that will have a huge impact on Canada's immigration system. We are not here to validate the process that is being used by this parliamentary committee. We have some serious concerns that we wish to air. First and foremost, we believe that the powers that are going to be given to the minister are arbitrary and do not have any precedent. We also have some concerns on behalf of the Canadian Arab community. and feel that some of these measures will one day lead to racial profiling. Today, our community is subject to procedures that are different than the ones that are used with other communities. The focus on economic immigration overhauls Canada's traditional immigration system. Canada in the past has not always given priority to economic considerations when it comes to selecting its refugees and immigrants. Our state is a multicultural state. It's a multi-ethnic state and a multi-religious state. We cannot focus solely on economic immigrants. This will affect other immigrants, and it will most notably affect those that fall under the family reunification category. In fact, we need to focus on that type of immigration. And that would actually address the problem of discrimination as well as obstacles that immigrants here are experiencing in terms of finding employment. There are hundreds of thousands of doctors who are living in the region, in the greater region of Montreal. In fact, 250 of them which have their credentials but are unable to work. There are 1,000 doctors living in the Greater Toronto area and are still awaiting employment. The government obviously has to address this situation. We are not against bringing over people who have expertise in engineering, for example, those who would be able to find employment in Alberta. But we cannot focus solely on economic immigrants. Thirdly, we feel that this bill does nothing to shorten the waiting lists. These proposed amendments will affect those who are going to make applications after February 2008. Lastly, I simply want to say that we are not here to criticize. We are also here to make an intelligent contribution to the debate. We feel that if the government truly wants to be inclusive and democratic, it must split this bill in two and make the immigration and citizenship, Part 6 rather of this bill, an entirely separate piece of legislation. I will be pleased to talk about some of the other sections that are also of concern to us later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to, we have an individual, Mr. David Cohen, who's an immigration lawyer. I'm sorry, Ms. Sharif.
Amina Shiraz.
Amina Shariz. I'm sorry. You do have a little bit more time. Go ahead.
I too want to hear my colleague David Cohen. I understand he has some very interesting comments to be making to this committee. I have set out the basis for our organization's concerns with respect to this bill in our policy paper, and I would commend the entire paper to you, and I would ask you to read it closely. I don't have the time to go through it, but there are very important points that need to be made which will expand upon our reasons for taking the position we have with respect to Bill C-50, and in particular Part 6. Now, there are 10 parts to this bill, and 9 out of 10 of them deal with fiscal matters, money matters, and then we have Part 6. The rest of the Act deals with money matters, and we seriously question why it is that this government has disingenuously and in our submission deceitfully snuck in IRPA amendments to this otherwise bill that concerns money matters. This leads us to our submission that if you examine the provisions, if you examine the actual proposals, that they neither give power that the minister already doesn't have with respect to, I would respectfully request committee members to allow me to make my submission. I only have 7 minutes.
Actually, that, yeah, we had 7 minutes per organization, and you were actually with the Canadian Arab Federation, so there's 7 minutes for the two of you.
Oh, we were told that we have 7 minutes for each person.
No.
Per organization.
Per organization.
Well, then I
So-
can save my comments for questions. I would welcome I would just commend the report to you, and I would welcome
No,
your
that's
comments.
fine. And we'll have more time for questioning, so we'll be able to get it in that way. So maybe that'd be the fairest way to continue. So now we'll move on to Mr. David Cohen, is an immigration lawyer. Mr. Cohen, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I asked to appear before you today because of a story that my late grandfather told me when I was young and impressionable. He spoke of how his younger sister fled Poland just ahead of the Nazi occupation and how she managed to secure a residency permit in England, valid for 1 year. My grandfather did everything he possibly could to convince immigration authorities in Ottawa to allow her to join him in Canada. His plea, however, fell on deaf ears. The door to Canada was shut. In the end, his sister was expelled from England back to Poland. She was never heard from again. Truth be told, we haven't always had an immigration policy to be proud of. I have been practicing immigration law for the better part of 30 years, and I state candidly to you that it was only in 2002, with the introduction of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, or IRPA as it's known, that decisions based on discretion were removed from our immigration selection system, at least as it pertains to economic immigrants. IRPA, in its present form, is a fine piece of legislation in which the selection of economic immigrants is based purely on objective criteria. It is based on the fundamental principle that everyone who chooses to submit an application to come live in Canada is entitled to fair and equitable consideration. The government is now proposing to amend IRPA. As part of the proposed changes, the Minister of Immigration would have the authority to issue instructions to immigration officers related to the processing of applications. More specifically, instructions as to which type of applications to process quickly, which applications to hold for processing at a later date, and most importantly, which type of applications to return to sender without any consideration whatsoever. These amendments, if passed, would change our immigration selection system from one that provides fair consideration to all applications in the order they are received, to a system based upon discretionary selection and outright denial of consideration. This would expose the immigration system to the type of discretion that IRPA finally eliminated. Please understand something, that the issuance of instructions by the Minister will not magically change anything. In practice, the Minister will have to delegate the exercise of discretion to immigration officers, who will pick and choose the applications to be processed. This will unavoidably make Canada's selection system vulnerable to human bias or worse. Don't get me wrong. I have a great deal of respect for Canadian immigration officers who, as a group, are professional and fair-minded. That said, I would like to place into the record a copy of a message posted on the public forum located on my law firm's website as a practical example of the danger of discretionary selection. I'm going to quote just from the beginning of the posting on our forum. It says, "Here you will read the ranting of a Canadian immigration officer. I've had it. I am so sick and tired of dealing with all the liars, cheats, frauds, etc. This line of work has tainted me to the point that I can't even look at most immigrants anymore without prejudging them as losers." The person purporting to be an officer, and I'm satisfied that the person is an immigration officer, continues on to denigrate a particular ethnic group and then concludes by stating, "Well, this felt good to rant a bit, and I'll probably do more of this, but for now, I have to go and deny a few people entry to my country." This is the danger when discretion is allowed back into the immigration selection system. It's real, and it will affect people. The Minister states that these amendments are required to streamline and modernize the immigration system. In particular, the government intends to use the amendments to clear out the current backlog, consisting primarily of 600,000 skilled worker applications. In addition, the government contends that the amendments are necessary in order to bring applicants whose skill sets are in high demand in Canada to the front of the immigration line. But in fact, these proposed amendments are not required to achieve the desired goals. IRPA, in its present form, contains the mechanisms to control the flow of economic immigrants, and to bring applicants desired by Canadian employers to the front of the immigration line. And IRPA does it objectively and transparently. Please allow me to explain. Simply put, the backlog exists because the number of new applications received every year is more than the number of visas issued during the year. We can all understand that. One of the IRPA regulations foresees this eventuality. It empowers the minister to set the minimum number of points required to qualify as a skilled worker, keeping in mind the number of applications currently being processed versus the target number of immigrant visas to be issued. The minister may therefore simply raise the pass mark above the current level of 67 points to curtail the number of fresh applications. People can count. They won't pay $550 in government processing fees only to be refused on the merits of their application. But the merits of their application will be considered. The minister may also make use of restricted occupations as provided for in another IRPA regulation. After conducting the appropriate consultations with provincial governments and other relevant stakeholders, the minister may designate it as restricted certain occupations for which there is little demand in the Canadian labour market. Potential applicants with experience in a restricted occupation would receive no points for their work experience, which would prevent them from qualifying under the skilled worker category, and they would therefore have no incentive to apply. This would ensure that Canada selects a higher number of immigrants who meet the immediate labour market needs. Finally, the present legislation allows for arranged employment in Canada. A genuine job offer from a Canadian employer entitles an applicant to an immediate temporary work permit or accelerated processing of the permanent resident application. This allows the best and brightest to be brought to the head of the immigration queue. To summarize, IRPA currently provides the mechanisms that permit the government to achieve all of its goals, namely cutting through the existing backlog of skilled worker applications and prioritizing the processing of applicants whose work experience is in high demand. IRPA is fair and it could work. I don't know if I have any time left, Mr. Chair. There were a couple of notes that I wanted to say about the backlog in general and would only take another minute.
Okay, very, very quickly, I'll allow it.
The subject of backlogs is complicated and more complicated than meets the eye. The government gives us the impression that the backlog is a single line of 600,000 skilled worker applicants stretching as far as the eye can see. In fact, the reality is very different. Some visa offices, like the one in New Delhi, have huge backlogs with a 5-year wait just to be considered. Other visa offices, like the one in Buffalo, can process an application to conclusion in just under 2 years. The situation is a direct result of the fact that the minister sets yearly targets to visa issuance at each visa office and assigns the resources necessary to achieve those targets. Therefore, the total number of pending applications is not the only aspect of the equation to consider. The allocation of resources is also an integral part of the problem. Perhaps the situation requires a redistribution of resources to the visa offices with the longest processing times instead of completely shutting the door. Thank you.
And thank you very much. We'll now move on to our last presenter as the Canadian Urban Transit Association. We have Michael Rocheleau, and you have Louise Poirier is with you. And I don't know how you're going to split it up, but the floor is yours. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's my privilege to serve as the President and CEO of the Canadian Urban Transit Association, the organization that many of you may have come to know as CUTA. And with me here is a member of our Executive Committee, Louise Poirier, who's our Vice Chair of Municipal Councils. Avec moi, Madame Louise Poirier, Vice-Présidente du Conseil municipal.
With me today is Ms. Louise Poirier, who's the Vice President of the ATU.
Because I really feel passionately that serving CUTA's mandate of establishing public transit as the primary solution to urban mobility in Canada is at the cutting edge of public policy in this country and touches so many of the important issues of the day. As MPs, if you think about climate change or clean air, transit is front and center as a solution. If you think about increasing our economic competitiveness based on efficient travel and commuting, you have to think of transit. If you think of healthy living and quality of life for the majority of Canadians, again, transit is there. Picture this. One city bus carries as many people as 50 cars, and one commuter train can replace 15 lanes of traffic. I'm sure many of the committee members have also heard from constituents about the increasing cost of gasoline. Again, transit is a solution. I'd also like to underscore that our transit systems have never been more optimistic about the future of public transit in this country. I can tell you from traveling across Canada that our members are engaged with the public, and there's a new spirit of cooperation about building and achieving greater things for Canada based on improved public transit.
Je vais maintenant prendre la parole. Merci.
You know that the population, or rather the public, truly realizes that using public transportation improves the quality of life for everyone. There are people who work in the public transportation sector who tell me regularly that the public favors the increased investment in public transportation. This is a mentality that is being reinforced by the fact that the federal government is now playing a leadership role in the area of urban transportation. And I can say without any hesitation and in full objectivity that over the last few years, all federal parties have played a significant role in working as champions of public transportation. In fact, there has been true leadership in the area of tax measures, financing, and other political actions that are good for public transportation. I can certainly tell you that we would not have been invited to appear before this committee to talk about public transportation. The federal government in the past did not have jurisdiction over these matters. In fact, of all of the parties we met with, each and every one has been well versed in these areas. And we want to thank all parties for their leadership on the issue of public transportation. In fact, we've made a lot of progress together, but there still remains a lot to be done.
This brings us to the essential element of the bill before you today, the establishment of the Public Transit Capital Trust and the investment of $500 million. This is an extraordinarily important investment and part of what leads to the optimism about public transit that we referred to earlier. The public supports investment in transit. This funding will make a real difference to allowing transit systems across Canada to meet the growing demand and growing expectations. The investment is good for the environment, the economy, and healthy living. That said, many pundits, politicians, and the media have raised the issue as to whether or not this is enough to meet the needs of Canadians and the needs of public transit. This is an important question, but in a sense it's less important than the question of how we can move forward to build world-class transit infrastructure and service in Canada. How can we do better? Clearly, cash injections are positive, but they have severe limitations. They're unplanned, and in an industry that requires long-term planning for capital projects, that poses problems. Regional considerations are also much more difficult to manage with one-time spending programs. So while the investments made in this bill provide real value, there's a better way for future spending. Canada remains the only G8 country without a national policy of long-term, predictable, dedicated transit investment. This prevents Canadian transit systems from achieving their full potential. Together with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, CUTA is urging the implementation of a national transit strategy. The proposed strategy has 5 elements. Number 1, dedicated federal investment to maintain, renew, and expand transit services across the country. 2, federal tax incentives for individuals who choose transit, such as an income tax exemption for employer-provided transit benefits. Number 3, support for research to enable innovation and make transit operations more effective and more efficient. Number 4, a requirement for recipient communities to approve integrated land use and transportation plans that make transit the primary means of serving future growth in travel demand. And finally, intergovernmental cooperation to ensure accountability measures are in place.
In conclusion, Mr. Chair, I can certainly say, since I sit on the executive board of this organization as well as the National Association for Urban Transportation, that it's very important that we all must defend a national strategy for public transportation. Secondly, increase congestion is just growing proof that the public wants better public transportation. In fact, over the span of 10 years, this has grown by 10%. I can certainly say that in 10 years, traffic will increase by 60%. Therefore, we are on the cusp of a crisis that we must be able to manage and is going to require more resources than we have at our disposal now. In conclusion, I want to say that the public transportation network requires stronger leadership on the part of the federal government that must work in partnership with municipal and provincial governments in order to develop an efficient long-term plan for urban and public transportation. Thank you.
And we'll now move on to the question and answer part. We'll start with Mr. Turner. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you very much to our guests for coming here today. We appreciate the effort. My question first is for the our witnesses from the Canadian Arab Federation. You've come here today, and you've been given 7 minutes on a panel of 3 groups to discuss an issue that deals with the immigration policy of our country. Do you feel this process is giving legitimacy to what you have to say? Are you satisfied by what you're part of right now?
No, we're actually, that's one of the concerns we have is with respect to the process itself. And the reason why is because we are appearing before the Finance Committee, and with all due respect, you do not necessarily have the expertise or the history in this area. Secondly, we have not been given adequate time, and we have not been given adequate, ability to make presentations. So there are radical changes that are being made. In fact, these are some of the most important changes that are being proposed by this government, and it's being done in a very quick manner. And as I mentioned earlier, they're being snuck into a fiscal policy, which is a really big concern, and I think has raised a lot of eyebrows with, and you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist, this is what we're hearing in our communities. Why are they doing it in this manner, and why are they railroading these changes in this manner?
Okay, just to let the committee know, and it won't cut into his time, just to let the committee know that Mr. Cohen has to leave for the Immigration Committee because they're studying this and we're looking for information coming back from the Immigration Committee. So he'll be leaving at 20 after if you have questions for him. Go ahead, Mr. Turner.
All right, so I heard you say, I think is the first recommendation to our group, that this bill should not be presented in the form that it is being presented. You believe that it should be split into 2 bills and a separate immigration bill, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Do you have an opinion coming here today as to why my colleagues across the way, in your opinion, why did they refuse to do that? Have you had any feedback from the government as to why they will not?
Well, we're not here to comment on political decision. I mean, this is up to the government to decide. But I think the most concerning elements in what we're hearing from the government side, it's the fact, even if we're going through this exercise, even if the Immigration Committee apparently had a motion to look at it, at the end of the day, they're not going to change one iota from this piece of legislation. So it's not just confusing for our communities in terms of being invited here and presenting, but also for the parliamentary system as a whole. Why are we debating it if the government at the end of the day is not willing to change nothing?
Right, but you've had no feedback. I mean, surely, is this the first time you've objected to the bill? Is this your first opportunity to speak against this particular bill as it's presented?
In front of a parliamentary body, yeah. This
Are
is
you
the
going
first
to
time.
the Immigration Committee as well?
Sorry, not yet. Not yet.
Have you applied to do so?
Yes, we will. Yeah.
All right. Well, I hope you're successful. Mr. Cohen, you said that this is a very regrettable departure from what you saw brought in with IRPA 2002.
That's correct.
Would you describe the attitude we're seeing in this legislation as anti-immigrant, or is that too harsh? Or I mean, what's the justification for the reasons that, I mean, what is the justification for the changes based on your 30 years of experience? How would you categorize that? If someone said, Mr. Cohen, why are they doing this?
Well, this is the question that I ask myself, particularly because, in my opinion, everything that the government desires to accomplish can be accomplished under the existing regulations. There really is no need to bring in this legislation to do what the government wants to do. So that leads me to believe that there must be other motives. And my own personal opinion on this is that they're political in nature.
Can you elaborate, please?
Well, I mean, I don't think it will surprise anyone in this room if I were to say that historically newly arriving immigrants have been a constituency that the Liberals count on. And at the end of the day, the Liberals are going to have to stand up and vote with the government, and I believe against the best interests of a constituency that they've been very close to for many years.
I'm shocked, Mr. Cohen. You're saying the government members are actually playing politics with this legislation?
Yeah, I'm as shocked as you are.
It's hard to believe. All right, can we just go quickly to the issue of transit here? Now, what's an adequate level of funding?
We've just completed a 5-year survey of the infrastructure needs for the entire public transit industry across the country, and that's come out at $40 billion over a 5-year period from 2008 to 2012. So that's what's been determined based on that next 5-year period, and that's the $40 billion that's needed both for infrastructure replacement and renewal of existing and for expansion to accommodate new ridership.
Let me ask you another question. The Conservatives brought in a transit credit in the first budget, I believe. Was that 06 or 07? That was 06. So the transit credit came in 2006. Thank you. I knew they'd know that. And I want to ask you, what's been the result of that? Have you seen transit usage go up as a result of that credit? Or have you measured any impact at all of that on your ridership?
It's a very interesting and very good question. It's hard for us to separate the cause and effect when it comes to ridership. There's so many different factors out there in terms of the growth of population, in terms of the fiscal incentives, in terms of the environment and the cost of fuel and operating cars. We've seen a steady increase in ridership over the last 10 years across the country of somewhere between 3 and 4% a year. And
has there been a change?
That has not changed measurably since 2006.
So there's been no impact to this transit credit that you can put your finger on?
What we have seen, and this is anecdotal, is that there's been a shift in the fare media where people are more likely to buy monthly passes and less likely to pay cash or use tickets.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll now move to Ms. Jacquet.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's very interesting to hear from two groups that have very different objectives. In fact, I think this is very representative of the bill that we are considering right now. I think we are dealing with a two-part piece of legislation. It deals, on the one hand, with budget matters, on the other hand, immigration. Now, had we met with the Canadian Urban Transit Association 10 years ago, well, allow me to say that we've asked, this committee, that is, has asked the Immigration Committee to look over Part 6 of this proposed piece of legislation because we don't have the necessary expertise to study it. And I think it would be worthwhile to separate Part 6. Quebec has a very specific agreement on immigration matters. Is there going to be an impact on Quebec, or will Quebec be sheltered from the negative impact of Part 6 of Bill C-50? Answer. Earlier I said during my introduction that between 2000 and 2008, there was a 46% increase in North African immigrants. This was mainly in Quebec because a lot of these immigrants are French-speaking. There are also political motivations at play. Governments feel that certain ethnic groups or certain minorities pose a problem and pose a threat to Canadian security, and so they are singled out. So yes, this will have an impact on Quebec. Obviously, well, in my riding, I can give you an example of a family that has just settled in my riding and who works in the agri-food sector, and they've made a very positive contribution to our village. In fact, we need more French-speaking immigrants. Now, turning to transit matters. You talked about the investment necessary in upcoming years. Now, did you say that $40 billion would be needed for 5 years? And that the fund is worth $500 million. So, in fact, you're expecting a significant increase for the years to come. Answer, indeed, we need a program that is permanent and that will ensure investment for the transit network throughout the country. Right now, we're dealing with projects that take years and years. In fact, a light rail project can take many years. Therefore, ad hoc, short-term funding is appreciated, but it makes it difficult for us to plan. Wouldn't you say that this would allow you to achieve two things in one single shot? This would facilitate transportation between greater urban areas and smaller towns, but it would also spur jobs and generate economic growth. It would generate jobs, in fact, especially during a time when we're experiencing economic slowdown. Don't you think this is a significant gesture that the government can make? So there should be a mechanism to allow us to use a portion of the surplus to improve our infrastructure. Absolutely. There are 2 points. Firstly, there is the manufacturing sector here in Canada. And 3 of the major bus manufacturers are located here in Canada, and a huge portion of our exports go to the U.S. So you're saying that those companies need new technologies, that here in Canada we can set up laboratories, if you will. Yes. Yes, especially when there is a parity between our currencies. There's a trend to export some jobs to the U.S., but there are also operational considerations. In order to provide our cities public transit, we need to hire locally. Therefore, there will always be economic spin-offs at the local level. Very briefly, allow me to give you an example. In Gatineau, there has been an investment of $200 million in the Rapid Bus project, and in fact that has generated many jobs in the area of Gatineau. And it has serviced many people who live outside of the area. And with the transit tax, companies will be able to target those cities that are the most in need of public transit. I must say that I hope that immigration legislation will put an end to the examples that you have cited, Mr. Cohen, and make sure that in the future we don't allow some of the problems that have occurred in the past to recur. Because some of the situations that you described were intolerable.
Very quickly, I will just say that the more discretion that is allowed into the immigration system, the more likely there is to be examples of the ones that I gave in my introductory remarks. The more we can limit the discretion and put a structure in place that is wholly objective and transparent, the less likely we are to see the kind of examples that I brought out.
Thank you very much. Mr. DeMastro, 7 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Cohen, in your opinion, somebody that participates in an internet forum, are they looking for anonymity?
No, sir.
So why are you protecting the individual that you claim to be an immigration officer that's posted these abhorrent comments that you've made here, alleging that they are from an immigration officer? Why are you protecting the identity of that person? Because I'll tell you, if they do work for Immigration Canada, I will demand that that person is fired today, because a person that makes comments like that has no place in my immigration system. Why won't you identify who that person is?
Well, it's the policy of our immigration website that we do not give the identity of anybody who posts on a public forum, but I will tell you this. I am wholly satisfied that the person, in fact, is an immigration officer, because not only did the individual place that posting, but there were 41 other postings that were made. And from those postings, it's evident that the person is an immigration officer. And more than that, I would ask you this question. If somebody is making a public posting like that and works in a facility that has more than 100 other employees, as this immigration officer states, wouldn't you think that this immigration officer's colleagues and supervisors might know how the immigration officer feels?
I would propose to you, sir, that if you know who this person is, that you identify who that person is, so that that person can be dealt with. Because otherwise, I'm going to disregard the comments that you've made as being the conjecture of an individual that would like to cast a negative light on our immigration officers, people that you started your comments by saying that you had respect for. I have no respect for someone in our immigration system that harbors that kind of sentiment towards people from other nations. I'll tell you that straight up. And if there is an individual working in our immigration system that harbors that kind of ill will towards other communities, they should be dealt with accordingly, because our immigration system has been, and will continue to be governed by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it does not allow for that kind of discrimination or those types of statements to be made against anybody. We protect people in this country, and we fight against sentiment like that. If there is a person in the employment of the Government of Canada that feels that way, they should be outed and dealt with accordingly. I'll tell you that right now. Secondly,
can I just respond to that part for a moment?
Please do.
You know, this individual, it really isn't about this particular individual.
Yes,
the difference between this individual and other individuals is this person is telling you what's in his or her heart. Most people won't do that. And that's why you need an immigration selection system that removes as much discretion as possible and relies upon objective criteria.
Sir, we have a broken immigration system with 920,000 people on the waiting list. It's broken. That's why changes are needed. But you would really have to convince me that there is something wrong with our officers when we have when Canada is the multicultural model of the world. Toronto has representatives of some 150 nations or more living in the city of Toronto. There is no way that you're almost indicating that you feel somehow that it's endemic within Immigration Canada, that people harbor these kind of sentiments about cultural communities, and therefore we're discriminating against cultural communities. I would argue that in Canada there is no evidence of that. And if there is an individual that does harbor this kind of feeling within them, then they should be outed.
Listen, individuals have biases. You really can't deny that. If you have a system that is purely objective, it really makes very little difference whether or not the person has biases.
Yeah. My next comment is an immigration system with, and to everyone that's here on immigration, you feel that the people on this committee don't know enough about immigration to be looking at it. I'll tell you that we have a full-time staff in my office in Peterborough, and I deal with immigration files regularly. There's probably no file that any person at this table deals with more intimately than immigration. We deal with it all the time, and it's because the system is broken. That said, I would argue that a system with 925,000 people on the waiting list is automatically it's automatically discriminating against people. In your case, sir, it's discriminating against people that can't afford to hire an attorney to assist them with their immigration system. Isn't that right?
It's not right at all. It really has nothing to do with the hiring of an attorney.
Do you work for everyone, or do you work for the people that can afford to pay you?
Sorry, can you repeat that, please?
Well, obviously, some people can afford to pay an attorney and some people cannot. That is a discriminatory system. We've got to fix it.
Right. No, people don't have to pay to hire an attorney if they want to come to Canada. That really isn't what the issue is here at all. The issue is one of giving more discretion to immigration officers to carry out the instructions of the minister. You talk about 925,000 people waiting in line, then I suggest that the government uses the mechanisms in the current legislation to bring people here quicker and to, if they want, curtail the influx of new applications. It's there. It ought to be used.
Mr. Rocheleau, you had a question a few minutes ago about, first of all, I like the comments that you made with respect to the income tax benefits for employer-purchased transit tickets. It's a good idea. I've had it mentioned to me by a number of people. I think it's a system that would actually pay real dividends in the transit system. I thought my colleague across the way might be interested in finding out that GO Transit ridership year over year, March over March, is up some 7.5%. I think that's I think that speaks to what you're speaking about, which is the increased demand for commuter rail and for commuter transit. I just had a real quick question on the $500 million transit trust. You indicated that was a great idea. Do you have any suggestion for the government how that should be? I know that that's been handed to the provinces for them to put to various priorities. What do you think? What do you think the split should be? How should that work out? Should we be focusing on what type of public transit do you think this country really needs? I know we need an integrated system, but what are we really missing out on in this country?
Well, I think the needs vary a lot from place to place depending on the size of the community. So I think what's important with investments like this is that they be equitable across the country so that there's the right amount of money available for a big metropolitan area like Montreal and Toronto, but also the right amount for a small community like Whitehorse in the Yukon that needs another bus. And I think distributing it to each province and territory by population makes a lot of sense. And then I think within each province and territory, there has to be a mechanism there that makes sense as well. And in the past, we've had experience with using ridership or using a combination of population and ridership as a way of making that allocation. But I think the equity there within each province is also very important.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move on to, actually it's Mr. Mulcair, but Ms. Chow wants to question, and she's a substitute. We can do this, but at the consent of the committee. If there's no problem with that, then we'll have Ms. Chow. Okay, fair enough. Ms. Chow, go ahead.
Yeah. Obviously, in a complex immigration changes, we want to have the time to study this. The Immigration Committee only have 3 days of hearings, and then on Thursday this week, there will be a report done. So within 4 days, that's it. So if your name is not on the Canadian Arab Federation, for example, if your name is not on the list by now, it's too late. You probably would not have a chance to come in front of the Immigration Committee. Having said that, the NDP has a motion in front of this committee and the Immigration Committee asking for cross-country consultation. What is your opinion of that? Should we take more time to study this complex immigration changes?
Well, obviously, I mean, the member of the government clearly knows that the majority of people who express their view about this particular piece of legislation are against it. I mean, the Canadian Bar Association, the Quebec Bar Association, we have expert immigrant, community organizations, settlement services groups. All those people are against it. Obviously, there is an issue. So if the government was really concerned with transparency and democracy, he needs to consult. He needs to have wider consultation process to be more inclusive. And definitely, yeah, we need more consultation on this issue. I mean, if we were happy with it, if we understand the impact of those changes on our communities, we would not be here. But it's not the case.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Cohen said earlier, and this is the question to the Arab Federation also, Mr. Cohen laid out very clearly that it's really not about the backlog, because having the backlog, all you have to do is hire more people and set a higher targets, and that the minister have the power to do so now, and that These immigration changes will have nothing to do with the 925,000 people in the backlog anyway, because the implementation date, if this bill passed, is February 27th, right, after the bill is introduced. So it has nothing to do with the 925,000 people that are in the backlog. And on top of that, Mr. Cohen said that the best and the brightest already right now has the capacity, if the minister chooses to, or under the regulations under ERPA, can in fact be able to come to Canada in an expedited manner. So it's not about the backlog. It's not about getting skilled labor to come to Canada as quickly as possible. Then why do you think the Conservative government introduced these sweeping changes? Whoever wants to tackle that question.
I think we'd be stating the obvious to say it's about a confidence vote. It's not fair to Canadians to be implementing legislation this way. It's part of a move towards legislative changes that will authorize instructions to be made in all sorts of areas, which will reduce political accountability. I think it has serious implications for our constitutional democracy. It certainly has implications for the rule of law, particularly when people are going to be making applications under a particular set of laws, and then arbitrarily those criteria will be changed and their applications will be refused without notice to them after their fee has been collected. After they've waited their turn, their application could be, as the Canadian Council for Refugees said, shredded. It has really huge implications also for our international obligations, and this is something I've set out in our written submissions. When we talk about humanitarian and compassionate applications not being required to be assessed outside of the country. So these are all very major changes that impact on, really fundamental aspects of our democracy. But this railroading of passing this legislation and the high stakes manner in which it's being done is highly objectionable, and it really calls into question the government's commitment to fair, open government.
Monsieur Boujnan, j'aimerais que vous reveniez sur quelque chose que vous avez dit tout à l'heure.
Mr. Boujnan, can you clarify something that you've said earlier? Since September 11th, you say that there has been a tightening of immigration applications. Can you please clarify? Answer. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees actually singled out Canada and said that this country did very little for Iraqi refugees. In fact, by increasing the number of Iraqi refugees, it had decreased the number for other refugees from other countries, which is rather contradictory. But I think it's very clear over the last 3 years in terms of percentages. The portion of immigrants accepted from Arab countries has been reduced by 30%. In fact, Arab and Muslim applicants have to wait 3 times longer than other applicants. Today, within the system, there are systemic obstacles that immigrants and applicants face. We are a huge country, and yet we only have 4 missions abroad that issue applications. When you look at Europe, there are more than 50 European missions abroad. The U.S. has a very high number of offices abroad as well. The majority of immigrants today who come to Canada come from Africa and Southeast Asia. Why not invest in those services so that people can come over more quickly? You also said that there were some 250 doctors living in Montreal. They are of Arab descent. They have their medical credentials, but they are unable to work in this country. Now, the minister appeared before this committee and said these changes are necessary in order to hire the necessary number of doctors. In your opinion, will this piece of legislation facilitate that? Answer, no. On the contrary, it's only going to complicate the process. The only government initiative that has been established is the setup of an office where people can register. If the government were truly serious to attacking this problem about the shortage of doctors, it would take other measures. This is of concern to me. It concerns me directly.
Thank you. My question is to Mr. Chair. My question is to David Cohen. According to your opinion, how this bill C-50 is going to affect the family class sponsorship, and how the new skilled immigrants, when they come to this country, will get jobs, when at present there are so many professionals and engineers, doctors, driving taxis and delivering pizza, and some of them are unemployed too.
Let me address the first part of your question, where you asked how this legislation will affect the family class or the sponsorship of applications. The truth is that we don't know at this point in time. The minister will be able to, by category of immigration, send instructions to process applications, as I said, quickly, to hold some back for later, or not to consider some applications at all. And this could apply to any class of immigration, economic class as well as family class. So we really don't know how it will in the future affect the sponsorship of spouses, the sponsorship of children, and the sponsorship of parents and grandparents. It's really impossible to tell at this point in time. We do know that there will be the power for the minister to issue these kind of instructions that will delay cases or speed up certain cases.
Okay, Mr. Mully, this is a little unusual to interject at this time, but Mr. Cowan has to leave. I'm just going to try this in a spirit of nonpartisanship. If Mr. Wallace has asked for one quick question for Mr. Cowan before he has to leave, if you will accept that, and I'll tack that time onto yours, that'd be fine.
But I need the question answer from Mr. Cohen, not from somebody else.
No, I know, but do you have more from Mr. Cowan? Then go ahead. If you have, his time is very tight. He has to leave for the Immigration Committee. But go ahead then, Mr. Molly.
You know, the rest of the question, do you know?
I'll answer you with respect to the skilled workers, professionals, and skilled tradespeople who come here to Canada and find it difficult to find their job in Canada. It's true, and I think that we have to make a greater effort among the professional organizations, among the skilled trade unions, to put more pressure on them to allow for doctors, for example, when we know there are openings in Quebec and Ontario, and yet they can't practice even though they've qualified outside of Canada and qualified inside of Canada. There's resistance there, and that's where the pressure has to be put.
So what's your opinion about the minister so sympathetic to the immigrants that she mentioned that she wants to clear out the backlog? And on the other side, when myself personally, when I asked the minister to issue a minister permit, somebody died in the family, she is not issuing a one minister permit. How she can clear the 900,000 backlog? And why she is so sympathetic? What's your opinion about that?
Well, you know, one way to clear out the backlog would be to send out instructions not to take in any skilled worker applications for a period of time, be it 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. At the end of that period of time, there will be no more backlog. I don't know that that's what the minister intends to do, because the minister has not at this point given any indication as to what those instructions will be. But the minister will have the power to clear out the backlog. The measures, however, I believe will be drastic if they are taken, and the discretion given to officers, I think in the long run, will be something that we ought to be concerned about.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wallace.
John, thank you for sticking in just very quickly.
That's fine.
You indicated that the legislation now allows the minister to set targets for different visa offices around the world, and you gave the example of Buffalo And part of the backlog, in your view, is because the number is smaller in some places and more people apply than what's actually allowed in.
Right.
Right? So what's the difference then if the minister has the ability to set, if they're allowed to set number targets, why should they not have the authority, whether it's a man or a woman, as a minister, to set occupational targets? That if skilled labor of whatever skill sets they are looking for are available, to me it's the same process. One's numbers, one's skills. Well, why not? Why not, if they have the authority to do one, why not have the authority to do both?
Right, and that's a very good question. With respect to occupations, the minister now has the power to set certain occupations as being restricted, saying for the time being, we don't need more accountants in Canada. And anyone who's an accountant won't apply.
That's on the negative side. But on the positive side, if somebody comes through, and we'll use just an occupation, for example, a plumber.
Right.
So we want plumbers.
Right.
It's not restricting plumbers, it's attracting plumbers. If someone comes with a plumbing application, they move a little further, closer to the front of the line.
But we still do allow that. If an employer is willing to hire that plumber from abroad, that plumber comes in immediately on a work permit. But let me tell you what. You asked, what's the difference?
What is the difference?
Here's the difference. When we have an application from the same qualifications being processed in Buffalo in under 2 years, but taking 5 years at the immigration office in India, at least we're saying to that individual who's waiting 5 years, look, it's not your fault that you have to wait 5 years, but at least we will assess your qualifications the same way as we assess the person who applied at the same time that you did in Buffalo. We will assess the qualifications in the same way. Let me explain. If today I submit an application in Buffalo and somebody else submits an application to the Canadian Visa Office in New Delhi, the one in Buffalo will be heard first. But the person who has to wait longer in India through no fault of his own at least will be assessed according to the same standards as the person who was assessed in Buffalo.
India and a plumber from the U.S. will get the same sort of approach.
I'm sorry?
A plumber from the U.S. and a plumber from India would be able to move up the list under the same
if they have a job, but say they don't have a job. A plumber from, I'm saying under the current system, at least both plumbers are being assessed according to the same objective criteria.
But the minister in this legislation, sir, is using a package of identifiers of skilled labor that's needed. It's not that a company B has to say that they need a plumber. The plumber has that opportunity to come here and find a job. And in this case, a woman is our minister. She's using a package of criteria or indicators of the types of occupations that are required. So it doesn't require a company to say, Mr. Smith from India, sorry, I shouldn't use Smith, I guess, we need you to come here because you have this specific skill that we want. It allows anybody with a certain occupational skill that's generally needed in this country based on those criteria or based on that analysis from a variety of approaches. So does it now? Your argument doesn't hold water with me, sir.
Okay, you made your point, Mr. Wallace, and I'll allow just a very quick answer, and then we'll move on.
Unfortunately, it's not something that can be answered in one sentence, but I would like to try and say that if it could be done fairly and objectively, you would have a good point. But in fact, it's going to require the picking and choosing of applications somewhere in the queue, and that's where it breaks down. I'm sorry, I really
Thank you very much, and thank you for our panelists for coming forward and testifying. Thank you for the questions. We'll now pause as we bring forward our second panel. Okay, we'd ask the... All right, we'll ask the cameras to leave, and we'll... Okay. Okay, we'll start our second round. We have our witnesses here, and we have members at the seat. Mr. Wallace, if you'd take your seat, I'd appreciate that. And we will start, we have four presenters, and we will start with the C.D. Howe Institute. We have Mr. Boschman. You're first up, and we'll give you the floor. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, and to all, and thank you and the committee for inviting me. It is always a delight to appear before this committee. Clearly, I am here to discuss this budget bill, and there's a lot in that bill. So I'm going to restrict opening comments to TIFSAs and Bank of Canada powers, so parts 1 and 10 of the bill. Let me begin by repeating that there is a lot in the bill, and this point deserves emphasis. Members of the committee are keenly aware of the importance of parliamentary process and may know that I believe MPs should have an opportunity to scrutinize legislation with the diligence it deserves. I will not second-guess the government's wisdom in bringing forward omnibus legislation like this bill, but I point out that doing so and packaging multiple issues together in one bill does make it difficult for any of us to give each aspect the scrutiny they deserve, or it deserves. So that said, there is much to like in this bill, and I've made no secret of my support for tax-free savings accounts, and I'm absolutely delighted to see the idea appear in legislation. When John Kesselman and I first wrote about the concept in Canadian context back in 2001, our focus was on expanding the range of options available for Canadian savers. We're concerned that on the one hand, people planning their retirements did not have enough tax-recognized contribution room in total. After all, the contribution limits on RSPs was much lower then, and at the time had not moved much over many years. But we had two reasons for prescribing something other than just bigger contribution limits. We made the general point that people are better off when they have more options for how they can save. At some times in anyone's life, it can make more sense to save out of pre-tax earnings, as with RSPs, and at others, we might be better off saving out of after-tax earnings, as with TIFSAs. So I should add that we labeled them tax prepaid savings plans because we wanted to emphasize that the tax had already been paid on the earnings underpinning those savings. So that reminder, explicit in the tax prepaid label, was really aimed at future governments because we were concerned that the plans would become very popular and large over time, and that future governments would see the accumulated savings as a target for taxing. And that brings us to the second aspect of why I think savings, or the option of saving in TIFSAs, is good for Canadians. And that is because RSPs are not right for anyone, or for everyone, pardon me. Consider an older worker, someone who perhaps immigrated to Canada late in life, who doesn't have much savings or a workplace pension. This worker will almost certainly rely on the guaranteed income supplement when she retires, and may be eligible for federal or provincial supplementary benefits. But what happens if she saves in an RSP? When she retires and begins to draw down her RSP savings, the withdrawals count in taxable income. But she must also count those withdrawals in establishing her GIS eligibility, and will lose entitlements at the rate of 50 or 75 cents on the dollar for each dollar of private income, including from her savings. So if she loses entirely her GIS eligibility, she'll lose access to other benefits, such as provincial top-ups or subsidies that are made available to people who qualify for the GIS. So some workers are no better off saving in RSPs than if they don't save at all. In fact, they may be worse off if they do. Now, some folks argue that low-income families don't save. In fact, they do. A few years back, GIS recipients had retirement savings totaling $37 billion, averaging about $25,000 each. But even if we thought that saving was rare, policy shouldn't punish people for doing it. And that's where TIFSAs come in, and I see them as beneficial for Canadian savers of all sorts. For us to take advantage of them, however, we do have to see the legislation adopted and supportive regulations developed and published. 2009 is not very far off, and if financial institutions are to roll out the new savings accounts, they need staff, they need promotional materials, they need to deal with their legal issues, and perhaps most important of all, they have to update their information systems. So all that has to be ready. So that implies two things. One, swift action from the government in passing legislation and regulation, if we are to see TIFSAs as swiftly in place as I would hope. The second, as we run through the regulation in particular, but the legislation too, we should see that wherever possible, TIFSAs be given provisions identical to those applying to RSPs. This is a good example of where policy can usefully be guided by practice. So, at this point, I would like to shift gears entirely while returning to the general issue of legislative scrutiny. Part 10 of the bill proposes broader powers for Bank of Canada. And indeed, the C.D. Howe Institute published a brief last year stating that an updated Bank of Canada Act was due because the types of securities the bank was permitted to buy and sell no longer reflected the modern financial marketplace. And that's a problem, because if the governor had to invoke emergency powers to respond to ordinary needs for short-term liquidity in support of otherwise solvent financial institutions, the announcement of an emergency would risk further aggravating the problems it sought to solve. Bill C-50 would broadly expand the governor's powers, subject to a requirement that the governor establish a clear policy and publish it 7 days in advance in the Canada Gazette, laying out how those powers could be implemented. And that's good for accountability. What concerns me, however, is whether the bank, with liberalized powers to buy and sell assets as well as lend, is sufficiently protected from pressure to prop up failing institutions and exposing Canadians at large to risks and costs that should stay parked with those institutions themselves. Now, the Bank of Canada is very well managed and recognized around the world for its independence and reliability. But it is dangerous to assume that this will always be the case and risky to lower the institutional barriers which protect that independence. After all, when faced with political pressure to act in a particular way, it is useful for an agency head to be able to say that the institution's governing legislation does not permit what the political leadership says it wants. So again, I think the bank will handle these powers well, but I do find the recent U.S. experience of grave concern. There, after all, the Federal Reserve has come under intense pressure to support financial institutions and to do so in some novel ways. For good or ill, the Fed has provided such support. So I see there some evident justification for my concern. So what to do about it? One modification would be to look for a longer lead time, or longer than 7 days, with respect to policy changes in what the bank may do in the course of its market activities, and to clarify that changes will take the form of regulations requiring order and council approval. Another would be for the legislation to be more prescriptive and less open-ended with respect to bank powers. So those are some options. With that, I think my time is up, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you very much for your time.
We thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now move on to Mr. Cunningham from the Canadian Cancer Society. I see you brought your lunch with us. I don't know if you're going to have time, or with you, I don't know if you have time to eat it, but we're certainly looking forward to your presentation.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, membre du comité.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of this committee. My name is Rob Cunningham. I'm a lawyer, and I am the Senior Policy Analyst with the Canadian Cancer Society.
Today, our most important single strategy to reduce tobacco consumption are higher taxes. And the very high levels of contraband that we find in Canada today are undermining the success of that strategy. Teenagers are particularly price sensitive, and the high levels of contraband are not only a problem of public health, but also of public revenue, easily more than $1 billion lost per year by federal and provincial governments, and also one of public security, given the nature of the problem. My comments will refer specifically to sections 50 to 69 of the bill, which we support, and we would urge all members of the committee to endorse. And we would like to endorse what was in the 2008 budget in terms of contraband prevention measures. First, to prohibit the importation or possession of tobacco manufacturing equipment, except for those with a valid tobacco manufacturer license. In the absence of this provision, there's inadequate control on the ability to make cigarettes. To make explicit the authority of the Minister of National Revenue to deny or revoke a tobacco manufacturer's license where inspectors have access to the premises that is impeded. And we know that's currently a problem. Changing the way roll-your-own tobacco is taxed to facilitate implementation of the government's new, forthcoming, sophisticated tax stamping system, itself a positive measure that we also support. Another measure in the bill and in the budget is to close a loophole for a product category called tobacco sticks, where they are taxed at a much lower rate than cigarettes. 9 of 10 provinces have closed this loophole. The market share has fallen to less than 1%, but it's a positive measure to prevent problems in particular in the future. And I'd like to take the occasion to acknowledge with support the announcement of Public Safety Minister Stockwell Day last week with respect to moving forward on enforcement related to tobacco contraband. There's a very serious recognition by the government of the magnitude of the problem. There's a political commitment to move forward. Minister Day recognized that this is one step in the process, that more measures in the future will be considered, and we agree that there's other measures as part of a comprehensive strategy that would contribute to having an impact. If I can invite members of the committee to turn to the handout, and on the final page is this graph. And this graph shows the comparative provincial Ontario tobacco tax rates in Canada. And we see that Ontario and Quebec have the lowest tobacco tax rate, yet they have the highest contraband levels by far. This helps to illustrate that the problem of contraband today in Canada is not one of higher taxes or of demand, but of supply. And the key to success is eliminating the source of supply. And we know what those are. The RCMP was very specific in its report released last week. Illegal operations on the U.S. side of Akwesasne in New York State near Cornwall, Kahnawake near Montreal, Tyendinaga near Belleville, and Six Nations near Brantford. And there's illicit distribution channels off reserve in various places, and in particular in Ontario and Quebec. What additional measures could assist? One, to persuade the U.S. government of the importance of shutting down the illegal operations on the U.S. side of Akwesasne. It is a national security threat to both countries. Canadian governments are losing vast revenues. By far, it is the most important source of contraband entering Canada. And we would expect that the U.S. government would ask us, Canada, to act if the reverse was occurring and the U.S. market was being flooded with illegal cigarettes from Canada. Second, to prohibit the supply of raw materials to unlicensed manufacturers, not only leaf tobacco, but also cigarette papers, cigarette filters, cigarette packaging. We need to choke off illegal production even before we get to the factory. Third, to establish a minimum bond of $5 million to have a tobacco manufacturer's license. Right now, believe it or not, it's possible to get a federal manufacturer license for as little as $5,000, which is a problem. And if we had a meaningful bond, we could have the financial leverage to encourage compliance, and if there's a failure to comply, that bond could be forfeited in whole or in part. Fourth, to have a tracking and tracing system, to build on the new tax stamping system that's coming, to monitor shipments, and to identify the point of illegal diversion. And fifth and finally, better promotion of the First Nation tobacco tax opportunity that currently exists because of the 2006 budget. This has a very low level of awareness, but if we could promote it more, First Nations can implement a tobacco tax equal to provincial tobacco taxes. They have to have an agreement, an arrangement with their province in which they're located, but this would assist. Contraband is a public health population-wide problem for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal kids and Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal populations. A very high smoking rate among the Aboriginal population is caused in part by long-standing access to cheap cigarettes, including very cheap contraband cigarettes. Thank you for your time. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to the Canadian Institute of Actuaries. We have Monsieur Bédard. Floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mon nom est Michel Bédard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Michel Bédard. I want to thank you for inviting the Canadian Institute of Actuaries to make its representations before this committee and to discuss the creation of the EI Financing Board. Our profession, our association, places the public interest well ahead of its own. This is why, in December 2007, we made public a report on funding of employment insurance, and this is exactly why we are appearing today. We support the creation of an independent board to oversee funding of the EI program, but we believe that several significant components of the program entail problems for workers as well as for the employers and government. The main rationale of this new system is to guarantee a balancing of costs and premium rates. as of 2008. However, obliging the board to strike a balance on a year-to-year basis represents a serious handicap, which will provoke erratic fluctuations in premium rates. Rates will have to increase at the first signs of a pro-cyclical recession.
A recession hits Canada. Unemployment levels rise to 8%, 2% higher than now. Increasing payments to out-of-work Canadians by about $3 billion. What happens? The board's $2 billion reserve is depleted totally. The EI account is forced to borrow another $1 billion from the government, even though, by the way, the EI account shows a surplus at this date of $56 billion. Unemployment levels might rise further. The government fiscal balance falls into deficit. When the premium rate is set for the following year, several things will need to happen. First, the $1 billion that was borrowed by the EI account will have to be repaid, and so premiums will have to rise to cover that. The $2 billion so-called reserve has to be repaid within a single year. Then, of course, there are increasing numbers of Canadians out of work, and so premiums have to increase to cover those extra costs. Well, consideration of raising the premiums above the legislative limit of 0.15%, which is in the current legislation, will then fall to ministers. This will not be an easy decision in a weakened economy and weakened fiscal position. We can look at the many times that the government substituted itself to the EI Commission in the past to see that this is a real risk and a real possibility. The impact on Canadian businesses, of course, which pay for nearly 60% of EI program costs, will be significant at those times when their cash flow and profits are severely reduced, and workers who foot the bill for 40% of EI contributions will also be deeply impacted. We believe that having a 5 to 7 year time horizon closer to the normal course of a business cycle would eliminate the necessity of raising premiums at the precise moment when they need to be stable, not increasing. Our calculations also indicate that an actuarial reserve of $10 to $15 billion would be needed to stabilize premium rates over such a time frame. The rest of the existing surplus, which now stands at $56 billion, as I pointed out, is not needed for the proper financial management of the EI program. Even during an economic downturn, which is not so deep as the one I described, but even deeper recessions might also be possible, but even during a smaller economic downturn, the one-year look-forward system would necessitate raising premiums on each occasion, pro-cyclically. Canada's actuaries believe that this mechanism needs to be abandoned. In fact, the proposed system is likely to produce premium rates which vary erratically from year to year, even in normal times, to recover normal forecasting errors. The so-called reserve of $2 billion does nothing to prevent this, as it must be rebuilt each and every year. In this sense, it is not a real reserve under that proposed system. It will not help stabilize premium rates at all. In fact, there is no fiscal cost for the government to any of this, of course, as the new board's operations will be entirely consolidated with those of the government. Bill C-50 also has a number of restrictions and override provisions which, in our opinion, minimize or undermine the promise of independence put forward by the Minister of Finance in the February 26 budget. Under Section 66.1 and 66.2, subparagraphs 2b in each of these sections authorize ministers to regulate what is binding on the board, in addition to the rules they have to follow in terms of setting premium rates for a year. Section or paragraph 66.8 allows ministers to override the 0.15% limit. Section 66.3 allows ministers to override the board without even any limit at any time. And paragraph 82 allows the Minister of Finance to dictate these loans and the pace at which they will be repaid. We conclude with 3 recommendations. First, as I pointed out, the Canadian Institute of Actuaries recommends that premium rates be set taking into account a 5 to 7 year period with an actuarial reserve of 10 to 15 billion drawn from the existing surplus of 56 billion. Maybe not all at once, maybe spread over time, but ideally given to a truly independent body. Second, the Institute recommends that Bill C-50 be amended to allow the Chief Actuary and the Board considerably more latitude in the assumptions and projections needed to develop the premium rates, taking into account a 5 to 7 year time horizon. Third, the Institute must, as a point of principle, reiterate our position of principle that the existing surplus belongs to the EI system and to its contributors, and should be addressed clearly instead of being swept under the rug once again. And in that domain, I must point out, of course, that the Supreme Court will be hearing this very situation tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move on to our last presenter. We have Lauren Waldman. He's here as an individual immigration lawyer. The floor is yours. 7 minutes.
Thank you. Having listened to my predecessors, it convinces me once again that it's extremely unfortunate that the government has chosen to put so many diverse issues into one bill. I found the presentation by the Actuaries Association extremely interesting, and I think it would be extremely important to take heed to what he said. The presentation by the Cancer Society the same, and my friend from the C.D. Howe Institute as well. So I wonder how much anyway, in any event, having said that, I will address the issue that I know about. I don't know about actuarial issues. I know about immigration law. I've practiced it for 30 years. I'd like to deal with the claim of the government that this has to do with the backlog. I hope by now it's abundantly clear that this legislation has nothing to do with the immigration backlog. It excludes the backlog from its application. If that's the case, the question arises, what are we going to do with this massive backlog? And I would suggest to you that first we have to understand how it came to be. It came to be because, and it's only a backlog that was created in the last 6 years, 900,000 applications in 6 years, because the law changed 6 years ago. How did we get to this massive backlog in 6 years? We got to it because, notwithstanding the fact that this government and the previous government had the tools in place to ensure that the backlog didn't grow, because they could have changed at any time the criteria, they stood by and allowed this massive backlog to exist. And we now have a backlog, and this legislation won't do anything about it. So we have to ask ourselves, why are we talking about the changes to the selection criteria if, in fact, we have 900,000 people waiting whose applications are going to have to be processed, which is equivalent to about 6 years' worth of applications in the backlog? There has to be a strategy to deal with this backlog, and this legislation has nothing to do with that strategy. The minister has suggested that we need this backlog, this legislation, because we need to have more flexibility in order to determine who we select to come into Canada. And as the previous speaker said from the previous panel, we already have that flexibility in place. The minister has the power to make political directions. One example is the provincial nominee program. There's nothing in the legislation that allows the provincial nominee applicants to get priority processing over other applicants, but they get it because the minister directed her officials to process provincial nominee applications more quickly. The minister can make any types of directions she likes, even dealing with occupations. I went to court 2 years ago and I challenged the minister's authority to do this in a case called Vasiri, and I lost. It was a case about processing sponsored applications, and I said that the legislation said parents and spouses had to be processed at the same time, and the only way the minister could give priority over spouses was through a regulation. The federal court said the minister has political power to direct processing of applications as she likes. That would apply to occupations, it would apply to provincial nominees. So the minister doesn't need that power through this legislation. The minister has said that this legislation does not authorize her to interfere in individual applications. That may be her intent, but as immigration lawyers, we've learned many times that professions of intent are meaningless when you go to the federal court and the court looks at the wording. The wording as it stands now clearly allows the minister to interfere with individual applications, and if the government is serious, they should introduce an amendment that expressly says that she cannot do that. I was at the Citizenship and Immigration Committee before, and someone from the bloc asked me, would it allow the minister to interfere with the power of Quebec to select immigrants? The answer is yes. The directions or instructions that the minister can issue are unrestricted, and indeed the minister could issue an instruction saying that all provincial applications are going to be given lower priority than others, or no priority, or whatever. And so that's extremely important for the people from all of the provinces to understand that the unrestricted power, and this gets to the question that was asked, so what's the problem with this? If we have the power now, why do we need this legislation? Well, this legislation gives the minister the power to override any of the rules and regulations or even the agreements that exist between the provinces. It gives the minister extremely broad, unfettered discretion with respect to who gets into Canada, where there is absolutely no political accountability, and that, in my view, is a very serious problem. The Conservatives came to power saying that they believe that there should be more participation there should be, by Parliament. What this legislation does, if it's passed, is it basically undermines any participation by members of Parliament in any aspect of the immigration process, because anything that's debated can be undermined by instructions issued by the minister when Parliament isn't sitting that wouldn't be subject to any debate. If this bill goes through before the end of this session and becomes law on June 30th, on July 2nd, the minister could issue an instruction that could totally change all the rules under which applications are being processed, and Parliament wouldn't have an opportunity to discuss it until October. This is extremely undemocratic and undermines the role of Parliament in debating and discussing immigration policy. In my view, it's not correct that the minister will be politically accountable as a result of publication. She may ultimately be politically accountable, but by the time any debate occurs, months will have passed. So I would urge the committee to really defer a determination of this legislation, because I think it's really ill-conceived, undemocratic, and I think it sets my final point is this: it sets a very negative precedent. If this legislation is allowed to pass, what is to prevent the minister from giving a minister of finance to be given powers to issue instructions about important matters? What is to prevent the minister of the environment to be given the same power to override the regulations through some kind of administrative fiat? Ultimately, we can give all the different ministers the powers to issue instructions, and then we don't need to have a parliament. We just have ministers who issue instructions. It's extremely dangerous precedent that is a further centralization of the power of government, and I think it's something that should be carefully considered before it's passed into law. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to question and answer. Mr. McKay will start. 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses. I agree completely with you, Mr. Waldman. We have 4 important issues, 4 important presentations. Can't possibly do justice to your presentation, and so I'm going to ignore you. I apologize. I want to thank also publicly Mr. Cunningham for his group's assistance in passing my private member's bill, Fire Safe Cigarettes. It's an important and groundbreaking piece of legislation. I understand it's pretty well gone around the world. So I think you need to be able to pat yourself on the back on that. But I too am going to ignore your issue, because we have a very limited amount of time, and we have a bill which has a lot of extremely important issues to it. So I want to start with Mr. Poshman on this increase in powers. I mean, on a theoretical basis, we sort of agree that the legislative authorities of the Bank of Canada need to be updated. But there is a perverse consequence to this, and that is that it appears, in effect, to reward bad behavior. So if Bank X is in difficulty because it bought a whole pile of junk, and Bank Y didn't buy junk on the marketplace, now Bank X can go to the Bank of Canada and say, Mr. Governor, I have this pile of paper here and I really need some money for it. Would you mind giving me some money? And under these authorities, particularly if there's any hint that maybe the bank has any difficulties with liquidity, the governor will be in an enormous amount of pressure to respond to that request on the part of the bank that behaved poorly in the marketplace. And I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. McKay. I agree that that is exactly the risk ultimately that presents itself to the Bank of Canada when powers are expanded quite liberally and open-endedly the way they are. I confess to some hesitance about saying so, because it is very important that an institution like the bank, like a monetary authority, should have the discretion it needs to respond to suddenly changing or quickly changing market conditions. But it is a power that must be used with extreme timidity. We should be very nervous about the prospect of a central bank bailing out institutions. We should be nervous about reducing the power or reducing the ability of legislation to construct a barrier between those pressures and the minister. So that is why, in looking for a middle ground in the Act, I suggested something along the lines of slowing down the process so that the bank isn't pushed hurriedly into doing things it might not otherwise like to do.
I take your point on the longer lead time and a more prescriptive, less open-ended. I wish that this was not, this particular expansion of the powers of the governor were not in this bill, because I think you've offered some very thoughtful insights, and I would like to hear from other people who think in this particular area. You made one comment about subject to political pressures, which I didn't quite understand. How would this make the governor more vulnerable to political pressure?
Well, first of all, Mr. Chairman, Mr. McKay, the potential pressure from financial institutions or from the political leadership on the Bank of Canada is always there anyway. In other words, the bank governors can read newspapers too and understand what sort of pressure is out there in the marketplace, sort of economically and politically. The political pressure can take the face of something we recently saw in the United States, where the U.S. Fed exploited some little-used powers, broadly expanded its activities by way of, for instance, bailing out Bear Stearns. The next thing we found was that Congress had many more things it would like the Fed to do, and perhaps embarrassingly from my perspective, the U.S. Fed immediately turned around and bought and underwrote a portfolio of student loans, and that's something I would never expected to see. So one of the things that legislation can do is construct a wall around the governor that says, well, that's very interesting, Mr. Minister or Mr. MP, that you would like me to extend liquidity in this way, but the legislation says I can't, and that can be an important defense.
All right, thank you. You make very valid points, and unfortunately I'm running out of time, and I wanted to direct one question to Mr. Bedard. Mr. Bedard, the proposal in C-50 seems to me to be a half-pregnant solution. I mean, there is an argument to be said that we could set up a separate EI commission, but when you underfund it from at $2 billion instead of $15 billion, and talk about the cyclical, I don't know why people say pro-cyclical when I think it's counter-cyclical, but that's just well, that's actuary talk. But I think your basic point is quite correct. And have you actually worked out numbers where if you projected a certain level of unemployment in a particular scenario, that in fact it would have a drag on the economy and make it more difficult for the economy to actually recover?
We are not economists, so no, we have not analyzed what the drag might be. We can determine, though, that an order of magnitude of 10 to 15 billion would be needed to carry us through recessions similar to the ones that have occurred in the past, and analyzing the variability in unemployment rates. Mm-hmm. The 2 billion as it stands now does nothing to stabilize premium rates because it must be rebuilt each year. You could have a zero in there and you'd have the same net effect. It doesn't really matter.
So effectively what you've got to do if you're having a down economic cycle, or you're in the down part of the economic cycle, you got to run around and find $2 billion, and you got to find it out of the people who can least afford to pay for it, namely the people who are still working, while many of their colleagues might well be unemployed.
Well, of course, yes, you have to raise premiums from those who are still working, but we say that mainly you have to stretch out the period. You cannot take each year one at a time. You have to look at it over longer.
The need for premium revenue, in fact, gets driven right on to the need to replace the $2 billion or the billion and the 2 plus 1 that you replace, instead of being spread on the general revenues of the federal government.
indeed, instead of being spread, in our opinion, over on the 10 to 15 billion on a longer time period, using the reserve.
Thank you very much. I think the point was made. Mr. Crête, the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Bédard. Are you aware of the changes that were made to the EI system? And for how long did you serve as a head actuary of the program? From 1990 to 1996. Now, based on your personal experience, can you tell me what kind of effect will the $2 billion limit on the reserve fund have on future government choices? Now, you're saying that we could have some very significant spikes and dips, but that the government does not have sufficient leeway to act. It depends. We feel that the $2 billion limit on the reserve fund will do nothing to stabilize the system. Now, obviously, that might have an effect on benefits, as we have seen in the past. And the $10 to $15 billion would allow for greater stability. Now, if there is indeed an economic slowdown, what will be the effect on the system? In the scenario of an economic slowdown, premium rates will go up. The system sets out a limit of 0.15%, but that can also be increased at the discretion of the minister. Therefore, employers are going to be very fearful of increased premium rates during periods of economic slowdown. And so the pilot projects that have been established for seasonal workers will probably remain pilot projects. I cannot comment on that. I can only comment on premium rates and contributions. What would be the rationale for the government to make such a choice? As has been done in the past, the $54 billion surplus is actually going to go before the Supreme Court tomorrow. And the problem was that the government had an exit strategy. It was able to use these funds at its own discretion and will. Do you know why the government made such a choice to set the $2 billion limit? Once again, all we're saying is that the $2 billion cap, under its current form, will not have any effect to stabilize the regime. We need a $15 billion reserve in order to stabilize rates for a period of 10 to 15 years. So $2 billion is insufficient. Even though we're talking about a significant sum, it's going to give us the same result. On a year-to-year basis, there are going to be fluctuations of the premium rates, and that's going to entail a lot of insecurity for companies and workers. The one good thing about this bill is that in future, costs will be balanced, with the exception of the reserve fund. We would have had premium rates that are erratic. So you think that we have to strike a balance between the two? We need a $10 to $15 billion reserve, and at the same time, we need to keep the benefits and make sure that money cannot be used for purposes other than that set out in the employment insurance program. Any further comments, sir?
I find it very interesting, but it again just highlights my concern that there's so many complex issues that are being put into one bill.
Je suis bien d'accord avec vous que
I agree with you entirely. We believe that that component of the bill should be studied elsewhere. Now, by next weekend, we are going to have the annual report of the Canada-US Parliamentary Group. They're going to talk about border issues. Specifically, actions that you have talked about. What would be the consequences if Canada were to crack down completely on contraband tobacco? Answer. 90% of illicit trade comes from Akwesasne. And those products end up on the Canadian black market. So obviously it is in the Americans' interest to fight this problem, and I'm very happy that this issue is going to be raised next week. The U.S. has to realize that this is a matter of public security. The contraband tobacco actually ends up in the United States. It returns to that country. In fact, it is the most vulnerable place. The municipality of Akwesasne is working with the RCMP and in Canada this is working quite well.
Thank you very much, and just to let Ms. Urquhart know that we've already put that on the agenda for next week in Santa Fe, so will be dealt with. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to Mr. Menzies.
Thank you, and I appreciate we're short of time here, so I'll share my questioning time with Mr. Dykstra. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Cunningham, I realize the cause, and I'm completely supportive of your association. You do some great work. I guess the first question: how easy was it for you to acquire those exhibits that you brought here? And I'm assuming they're not samples for us.
You're right, and they're examples of cigarettes that I personally purchased on various territories: Tyndonega near Belleville, Kahnawake near Montreal, or on the American side of Akwesasne. They do not have, the products sold in Canada do not have the picture-based health warnings required by law in Canada. They do not comply with the ignition propensity standard for fire safety and flammability, pursuant to Mr. McKay's bill, and they're very cheap. Perhaps $6 for 200 cigarettes, a carton of 200 cigarettes, compared to the legal price of $50 to $70. It's a massive problem, and they're extremely easy to acquire. And non-natives are abusing the exemption by going on reserve, and products intended for reserve are being diverted off reserve. It's very easy. People can have them delivered to their workplace or to their home.
Very, very troubling, and I appreciate you bringing that, not bringing the products, but bringing that awareness to us. And I guess my question is, and from a colleague of mine from Calgary, he was sharing with me just last night on the plane how much of this is actually getting through into Alberta. And our tax regime, as you know, in Alberta is far higher than anywhere else. So there's more profits to be reaped in Alberta, and yet they seem to be making it all the way up Trans-Canada Highway out into Alberta, and I would assume all the way to British Columbia.
Yeah, I mean,
how do we stop it? I mean, we've put some actions in this budget implementation bill. What more do we do?
Yeah, I mean, in Alberta and British Columbia, the problem is there is some contraband, but it's comparatively minimal when we look at Ontario and Quebec. And one of the reasons for that is that there has not been a history of acceptance of illegal sales to non-natives on reserves. So in British Columbia, for example, an on-reserve retailer started to sell contraband of this nature and was shut down by the RCMP with the support of the First Nations government. And so we don't have the same problems in the West in terms of Alberta and BC. What more can we do? We need a comprehensive strategy. There's a role for provincial governments as well that I've not touched on, but there's a series of recommendations in my introductory remarks of measures that are not yet implemented, including available measures that do not require on-reserve enforcement. So we need the measures that have been announced are positive, but there are significant additional measures that are also available for implementation.
Okay. I'll turn it over to Mr. Dykstra. Thank you.
Thanks. Lauren, I just have just one question. It kind of pertains to also, I guess the word deceit, which was a word that the person used who was sitting in the chair before you used in terms of moving this forward. So I didn't hear you use that word, so I would like to at least take a little bit of direction from you. And you did make the comment about the minister could potentially make a decision on July the 2nd that wouldn't end up being heard by or couldn't be pursued or at least asked about until Parliament would resume in the following September or October. And while ministers are questioned on decisions from time to time in the House of Commons, I do pause and reflect upon that because it suggests to me that, and I asked actually the ADM who came in to respond to a number of these questions after the minister had been here, about the type of latitude that you're suggesting, and it borders upon the minister actually doing something illegal. And when I spoke and I asked the ministry about this, I mean, they gave a pretty detailed response. First of all, annual levels exercise, which the Government of Canada, goes through each and every year, and it's then published. It has to be, any decision has to be consistent with the objectives in the Immigration and Refugee Act. It also has to be consistent with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that everything we do basically has to be consistent with that charter. And it obviously, certainly, explicitly prohibits any form of discrimination. So I want to be clear that what you're suggesting isn't that the minister is actually going to do something that goes against the Act or, in fact, goes against the charter, because it is what you're suggesting in a way, because you're saying, well, she can have, she's got these sweeping new powers, which actually isn't the case when you actually go through the Act, because she has some, the minister themselves actually has some latitude as we speak now. So I want to be clear that what you're not suggesting is that she would actually do anything untoward or illegal, because that certainly she wouldn't be allowed to do that in the first place, regardless of whether or not she had the power to do so.
Well, let's separate this out, and I'll answer it by sections. First of all, let's be clear. Unless you put an amendment into the Act, which you could easily do, you could put something in saying nothing in this provision allows the minister to issue an instruction with respect to an individual applicant. The wording of the legislation does allow the minister to make a decision with respect to an individual applicant. There's no doubt. I've heard, as I said, there was a case in the federal court called Cha, where one of my colleagues relied upon something that a minister had said about when this current IRPA was enacted in 2002, and the federal court said, well, we always consider what the minister says, but in the end of the day, we look at what the legislation says, and that's what we interpret.
Well, what my question is specifically is, were you suggesting, and I'm not trying to corner anything, I just want to get a straight answer from you, because what I took from your comment was that the minister would, in fact, make a decision that went against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Well, with respect to individuals, she could make a decision, and it would, as long as it didn't result in sending someone back to torture, it wouldn't be inconsistent with the Charter, but it would allow her to make a decision with respect to an individual applicant. With respect to classes or categories of applicant, it's interesting that you invoke the Charter, because a lot of these applicants are outside of Canada, and indeed, the federal court has said, with respect to immigration matters, that the Charter doesn't apply to applicants outside of Canada. So the Charter wouldn't necessarily be a remedy for someone if the minister issued an instruction outside of Canada.
The refugee may not be, but certainly the minister is.
No, well, the minister, when she issues an instruction with...
The minister is a Canadian, so the minister, in fact, would be bound by the Charter in terms of her decision-making process.
Well, if the minister issues an instruction with respect to applications outside of Canada, the applicants outside of Canada can't invoke the Charter to challenge the minister with respect to those applications. That's the point. The long and the short of it, then, if you talk about the objectives of the Act, of course, we all know that there are very many different objectives of the Act. So the minister could issue an instruction instructing the visa officers to not process applications from Quebec, but to process applications from British Columbia, because there's an economic downturn in British Columbia, or there's an acute labor shortage there, and it would be consistent with the Act.
Mr. Waldman, I'm suggesting it wouldn't hurt the credibility of your argument if you actually gave some credibility to the individual rather than background suggests that the direction they're going to move in is negative rather than direct according to the legislation.
Well, the
sorry, Mr. Walden, we'll leave it at that because we're cutting into our last questioner's time, and I don't think he'd appreciate that. Mr. Mulcair, the floor is yours.
Monsieur le Président, ce sera la moindre des politesses de permettre à
Mr. Chair, I think it would just be out of pure courtesy to allow the gentleman to finish his testimony.
The concern that we all have here is about giving the minister such broad, unfettered discretion. In our view, it's not acceptable. The minister should be accountable to Parliament. There should be pre-publication, pre-debate, be it an instruction or a regulation. And that's the point here, nothing more, nothing less. And when you give the ministers unfettered discretion in immigration, we've seen in the past that it's been abused in many different circumstances. So obviously we have a concern about that.
Monsieur le Président, je tiens dans un premier temps.
Mr. Chair, first and foremost, I wish to thank Mr. Waldman for his answer that he was able to complete. Secondly, I want to say to what extent we agree with his statement. In fact, from the very beginning of this story, from the very beginning of this debate on Part 6 of this bill, we have said loud and clearly that the first problem and the most flagrant problem was the level of discretionary powers being conferred to the minister. And I think the most obvious example is that we are exchanging these powers for very little in return. We are saying that he may beforehand and shall take these measures henceforth. I'd like for you to elaborate on one aspect of your presentation. Now, the witness isn't saying that Bill C-50 changes the current agreement on immigration between the Canadian federal government and Quebec. What he's saying is that because there are no limits on the famous orders that the minister could emit, he may emit directives and change the agreement with Quebec. Is that properly interpreted?
As I said, as long as there's no... Je m'excuse que je ne parle pas en français.
Sorry, I don't speak French.
There's no... As long as the legislation does not put clear limits, the discretion of the minister as it now stands is not fettered, and it would allow the minister to make changes that could affect the agreement with Quebec. Now, Quebec could then challenge that constitutionally, but that would be a lengthy process, which may or may not be successful. If the minister is saying that they have no intention of doing these things, then it should be clearly set out in the Act what powers the minister wants and what powers the minister doesn't want. So the minister could agree to an amendment that says nothing in this legislation allows the minister to issue instructions that will have an impact on provincial nominee programs or the Quebec-Canada Immigration Accord. Nothing in this legislation will allow the minister to make instructions with respect to individual applications. This is what the ministers have been saying, but it's not what the legislation says.
Well, we agree with you on that one as well, and I think that that's precisely the type of amendment that you'll see being proposed. But as you can see, there is an attempt to railroad this thing and take advantage of the extreme weakness of the Liberal Party. We wanted to ask, j'aurais voulu demander à M. Cunningham une question.
I wanted to ask Mr. Cunningham a question. Mr. Cunningham gave two examples of the accrued threats of illicit goods. For instance, there are no warnings. So a person purchasing 200 cigarettes for $6 probably doesn't care about any health warning. Mr. Cunningham also talked about security and the fire hazards. But has anybody taken the trouble to verify the contents of these cigarettes? I know that you've included a list of some of the additives that are put in these illicit tobacco products. Now, I don't think we can count on those contraband traders to be altruistic and add such information, can we? No, Health Canada has a regulation that forces manufacturers to report all of the ingredients used in their tobacco products. Obviously, contraband tobacco producers don't respect those regulations. Generally speaking, not a lot of tests are being imposed. But cigarettes, whether they be illegal or not, kill. So we can't really say that contraband cigarettes will kill more than legally sold cigarettes. We can't say that cigarettes sold on reserves are less cancerous and less toxic. So there is an obligation to provide information. If I have some time remaining, Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Michel Bédard and talk about funding of the employment insurance system. Now, when we talk about sustainable development, we talk about sustainable development when we talk about the environment. But in fact, what we're doing here is trying to alleviate the burden on future generations. And once there are fluctuations in the economy and fluctuations on premium rates, it's future generations who are going to have to pay and foot the bill. Yes, absolutely. Rates will vary erratically, particularly in the case of a recession. Great. I have no more time for the C.D. Howe Institute.
Thank you very much, and we appreciate the testimony. We appreciate the questions, and with that, I want to, before we adjourn the meeting, just remind everyone that we should exit the back doors. I believe there's a problem out the front doors that we should not exit that way, so we're instructed to exit the back and make your way out of the building. So thank you. Meeting adjourned.